They told you not to start with a description of the weather. They told you not to start with someone waking up. So you're going to start in the middle of the conflict. You're going to have your main character running for her life in the first scene. That'll hook them, right? Unfortunately, probably not. My name is Michael Carr. I'm a literary agent with Veritas Literary, and this is How to Hook an Agent. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call the white room syndrome versus the cliffhanger opening, and why both of these are oftentimes mistakes when you're opening with your story. If you're new to this channel, you might go ahead and consider subscribing, where you can get some new content. I'll be recording new videos about the agenting world and publishing industry in general, as well as videos like today's, which are going to be a little bit more focused on the craft. And today I want to talk specifically about how to open your book. Now, you've probably heard it said that you shouldn't open with a description of the weather or with someone waking up. Other common variations on this theme is someone trying to remember what happened the night before, someone looking out the window, someone looking in the mirror. These are what I call white room syndrome openings, and I believe they represent the blank canvas that is being presented for the writer in that given moment. You don't know exactly how to start your story, and so you're going to have your character be equally confused or equally beginning to do something, and unfortunately that something is not usually very interesting. You can think of exceptions, I'm sure, where you can think of great stories or books where someone has starts off with someone waking up or with amnesia. I believe that Roger Zelazny uses it for his Princes of Amber series, if I'm remembering right, because I thought the exact same thing when I had it. The character wakes up and he's got amnesia, and the whole rest of the initial part of the story is it unfolding as to what happened. It can be done in the hands of someone probably more skilled than you or I, and also probably someone who was writing 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. One of the main reasons not to do this, if I can't convince you for any other reason, is that it is done so often and is such a sign of amateurism that when it comes up and I see someone waking up or with a description of the weather or whatnot, it's generally a sign that this person doesn't know what they're doing. If you get to the point where you want to have that opening and you've got a bunch of books under your belt, you're a professional author and you're well known, people are going to give you a lot more leeway. But in the beginning, try to avoid it for that reason, if nothing else. So people hearing that then go and try to do the opposite. They try to put their character in some sort of critical fight or flight situation. They're going to die at the end of this scene if they don't escape. Those frequently fall flat too, for a reason that's ironically very closely tied to the reason why the white room syndrome opening doesn't work either. This sort of opening is more common. It's commonly used professionally as well in something you might see it in thrillers, for example, some sort of suspense novel. I've done it myself where there's a main character and the main character doesn't survive the opening scene. It can be done. It's not my favorite. And the reason why, frankly, is because we're not emotionally invested enough in that character to care at that moment. So if you think about your opening of your story as being a microcosm of the overall plot of your book, and you realize at the same time that your number one goal in those opening sentences is to keep the reader reading, then you start to realize exactly what the problem with these two types of openings is. A story in its most basic form is a three-legged stool of a character in a situation with a problem. Everything is going to develop from that, right? The character is going to attempt, hopefully she's going to attempt to resolve that problem. The problem is going to change or modify. She's going to probably fail at that a number of times. The goal is going to change with time. And it's the character is someone who's very clearly defined, individual, doesn't just represent a type, isn't just any old person. The situation is a very clear context. So we understand, for example, you can easily establish a situation if you say, your main character is a Jew in Poland in 1939, then you exactly know, you don't have a character yet, but you exactly know what the situation is and what the problem could easily be. Maybe not, that's not the only situation or problem, but that's an indication of what situation and problem is. Problem is staying alive due to a situation of Nazi Germany invading Poland, for example, right? Which is kind of in its most basic form. So that's me giving a very lazy shorthand for what a situation and a problem means. Those three items are a stool in the sense that if one of the legs is too long or too short, then the whole apparatus becomes unstable. So if you have a character who's running for her life in the first chapter, and you don't really understand very well, you're not emotionally invested in that character, it feels a little bit like a cheat. And the person's not really the reader is not really going to care all that much what happens to that character because they're not emotionally invested yet. Right? It sounds kind of strange to say that we don't really care about someone running for her life. And if she dies at the end of that chapter, well, that's too bad. We probably, if we're reading a certain kind of genre, we knew that was going to happen anyway. And we recognize that's just a placeholder to kick off the plot for the real characters who are going to come later, which is a problem. I believe it's something that I've seen a lot in the genre. So if you think about how the news puts together a story, what they're going to do is try to give you the character, right? A woman was found dead yesterday in such and such canyon outside of town. She was an avid runner who was training for a marathon to help raise money for cancer treatment for her sister. And she had raised $150,000, right? The more compelling the character, the more the readers are going to keep reading that instead of just skimming in a sense of, oh, that's kind of scary. Someone was found dead. And then, how the person died, of course, is going to depend. It's going to influence our level of interest as well. If it's suspicious or if she just fell or, if someone had a heart attack, then we're going to be reading primarily for the character. If someone was killed by a human or an animal or something, then our level of interest is going to be different. But notice that they're always going to focus on the character, and that's because the same sorts of things that draw your interest in a nonfiction environment are what's going to draw your interest in fiction. So if you look at the other side of things where someone is waking up, it could frequently what happens is someone is then relying too much on the character. So they're waking up, they're badly hungover, and they're thinking back to the previous night when they went and got really drunk because they learned some bad news or something like that. We're not really, we don't really have, we're getting a situation little by little, and we're getting the character, but we don't really have a problem. Like, what is this character trying to do? He or she is just mulling over the events of the previous day. And that's kind of this white room syndrome that I was talking about a little bit. So what do you do? Because as I mentioned, the number one goal in this story, at the opening of your story, is to get people to continue reading. And maybe you've got this scene, your idea is for someone running for their life. It's a scene that would have the reader's heart pounding on page 50 or 100. But on page 1 or 2, they're just not invested enough, and maybe they're skimming, like, does this person die? Oh yeah, she dies. The cougar ate it, whatever it is. And so how are you going to get to the point where 50 or 100 pages down, you have the character running for her life and it means something? And running for her life might be literal or it might be figurative, right? Because every story has a life or death situation at its core, but it's not always a physical death we're talking about. It could be emotional or spiritual or career death or death of a relationship. But in order to get to that point, what we have got to do is develop those three legs of that stool in conjunction. And we don't have a lot of time. We got to get going. We got to get a little bit of a hook going. And then very quickly, we've got to get in there and start building these. So a really good way to do this is to start with a problem that is a significant problem. Maybe it's not fully explained, but is something that people can recognize and leaves a little bit of a mystery without it being overly explained. So, for example, you might have someone who is rushing to, you see him in his room and he's rushing to pack and looking up at the clock, and you don't know if maybe he's going to miss his flight or whatnot. That's your first couple of sentences. Sentence 3, you realize it's before his wife comes home. So now you're wondering, well, is he leaving his wife? Is he whatever? Then you have him look down at, I'm just making this up off the top of my head. You have him look down and he's got a bad burn mark on his arm. So now you're there's a hint that maybe there's some physical danger or something. But at the same time, you start to introduce a situation. Maybe in this case, it's a troubled marriage, or maybe it's, what's more is you see that he's got to get out of there to protect his wife before she gets home. And so you're starting to build up a character has some serious concerns, and we get just a hint of a background without explaining too much. We have a little bit of a danger, but we don't know the level of that danger yet. And then we have the situation, which is must hurry and get this done. Notice that in this scenario, the character is also being proactive. And this is just kind of like the beginning. What we just discussed here could very well be the first page. But if you execute that well enough, I guarantee the reader is going to want to flip to the second page to find out why. It may be that you just relentlessly, because this is a thriller, a suspense novel, that you're just going to relentlessly escalate from there. That every moment and every page, things are going to get just a little bit worse with the usual rising and falling action, but rising to some peak. It could be that this situation is just setting up a transition into the larger plot for the overall story. But notice the scope of it. Right? The scope of what I've just described is not so huge that someone can't understand it. It's got a little bit of a time component. There's a little bit of a mystery. We can see that this individual's kind of stressed about something, and he's working in a very concrete fashion. So you don't want to explain everything that's going on here, but at the same time, all of the details should be clear. There shouldn't be confusion about where he is or what he is doing. We don't necessarily know why he's doing it yet. And you're going to delay the payoff on those sort of things until you have to introduce some more details. But hopefully by that point, the reader is emotionally invested enough in continuing forward that you can start to introduce problems that have greater stakes, that are closer to that life and death situation that we're talking about. And so your stool legs, it's a kind of an imperfect metaphor, because a real stool can only get so high before you can't really sit on it. Whereas depending on the genre, the character, the situation, and the problem are going to develop bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and stronger throughout the whole course of the book. And in another way that's an imperfect metaphor is depending on the genre, the problem might be more important, or the character might be important, depending on where you've chosen to give emphasis. But that's kind of the idea. If you develop any one of those three things out of sync with the others, you could easily have your World War II scenario with let's say on the beach at Dunkirk, where the situation is overwhelming. But if you haven't introduced the character and their specific problem, which should probably be something other than just can I get on the boat in time, but if you haven't introduced those other elements, the situation can be super strong, but the others are not strong enough to maintain it either. So that's a little bit of why those two kind of openings don't usually work. The white room syndrome is worse probably than the cliffhanger, but I will say, unless you really execute that cliffhanger well, you'll notice that even in the thrillers, when they're introducing the woman running up the canyon and the beast, let's say it's a genetically modified cougar or whatever. Let's say there's a beast up there and it's a scientific sci-fi thriller. You're still going to be introducing the character in a way that is going to draw their interest. Actually, and a good example of this is the opening chapter of The Stand. If you've ever read that by Stephen King, where the guy's fleeing the biocontainment kind of a pandemic sort of an opening where there's been contamination. He's carrying this superflu out with him, but you can actually see his motivations and what he's trying to do. And Stephen King is a master of really quickly characterizing someone. So, if you're writing in that genre, that's probably a good opening to look at. There are some things you can do, but notice that anyone who's skilled at that genre is going to be working furiously to try to get the character in the situation strong enough to support that sort of cliffhangery sort of opening instead of how you might end a chapter. Anyway, those are some things to think about. Take an honest look at your own work and see if you are falling into any of these traps, and ask yourself this. It's a simple way to look at it, but ask yourself this three-legged stool question and how you're developing your story and if those things are in conjunction with each other.